Hello, this is part 2 of the lecture on quantitative and behavioral genetics, and so I will move right into our PowerPoint. Okay, so far we've talked a little bit about what does it mean when we talk about the term heritability, because when we're studying complex traits like personality or IQ or something even like height, some physical traits. These traits are in fact partly heritable, but also partly influenced by environment or environmental conditions. And we talked about what heritability means in the last video. In this video, I wanted to point out how twin studies are often used to kind of tease apart the genetic from the environmental component of a complex trait. Recognizing, of course, that there is a very important interaction between genetics and environment as well. In any case, twin studies are used all the time. Here's a picture of my triplets when they were younger, and they're clearly fraternal triplets. And I just wanted to point out that, yes, indeed, they, as all siblings, have some similarities, but also lots of differences in their personalities and in their likes and their passions and in their beings, right? So let's take a look at a little bit of history in this video. So twin studies are actually really useful for trying to tease apart the genetic and the environmental components or attributes in a trait, in a complex trait. But people who studied twins, or at least early on, really didn't do justice. And here are a couple of examples. So an early researcher, Francis Galton, really intelligent person in the 1800s, a cousin to Charles Darwin, a statistician who wrote a series of books, including one on hereditary genius. This book on hereditary genius hypothesizes that superior human intellect is passed along from parent to offspring by heredity somehow. At this point in time, researchers didn't really quite understand how genetics worked, right? But he looked at, intelligent people in his day, and he looked at their lineages, and he came up with this idea. And that kind of sparked what's called the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement is this idea that, if we can selectively breed humans, we can select for better humans. We can improve our human population if we select away undesirable traits and we select for desirable ones. This, of course, this movement grew and has an important, sadly, an important part of our history, American history. But then, of course, it grew into what we saw in Nazi Germany, where certain groups of people were killed because Nazis were trying to remove them from the gene pool, essentially. In any case, Francis Galton didn't really plan to start, no one plans to start a movement that ends with Nazi Germany. Let's just go with that. One of the things he did was he looked at twins, and he, in the 1870s, discovered that there are these two different kinds of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins, and he came up with a hypothesis that actually is pretty accurate about how twinning happens. Remember that identical twins share 100% of their genetic makeup, essentially, because a single egg and sperm develop into an embryo that splits into two individuals, whereas fraternal twins only share 50% of their genetic makeup, much like regular siblings, because there are separate eggs and separate sperm that give rise to the two embryos that grow, right? Well, he decided to do a study with twins, and he found 35 pairs of what he called identical twins and 23 pairs of non-identical twins. And he looked at similarities and differences between the pairs. And it seemed to him that identical twins resembled each other in so many ways. And non-identical, and continued to resemble each other throughout their lives. They shared the same interests, the same personalities, the same kinds of events happened. Oh, I have a toothache in one tooth, and it would happen in both of the twins. And non-identical twins or fraternal twins started out maybe quite similar, but seemed to separate more and more as they became older. And his conclusion then was, look, nature or your genes, your genetic makeup, prevails over nurture. It doesn't really matter what you're exposed to environmentally. If your genetic makeup is the same, like identical twins, then you will continue to share similarities, even if you're experiencing different environments. So he came up with this idea that nature prevails over nurture. Nature versus nurture. He was one of those people who used that phrase. Okay. Other twin studies that happened, also, again, attempting to tease apart nature from nurture, these twin studies turned out to be not very effective at that because, frankly, they were, one, unethical, one of them was, and one simply basically a set of lies. So one of these is Joseph Mengele, a physician in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, who ended up at Auschwitz and had this terrible fascination with twins. Mengele was one of the doctors who propagated the idea of eugenics, in particular of basically destroying some people because they should be selected against, versus maintaining others, other lines, the Northern European lines, etc. So what Mengele did with twins was he selected them out. They tended to survive at higher rates, actually, in Auschwitz than anyone else. But he did all sorts of unethical things to these twins, and then he compared their results. So he performed things like exposing one to a disease and not the other, performing surgery on one and not the other, doing all sorts of twin studies that are incredibly unethical and are disgusting. And so his research has just been thrown out as being absolute disaster, right? Another person who studied twins found Cyril Burt found 53 pairs of twins, identical twins, that were raised separately or raised apart. And so this is interesting in itself. In the 1960s is when this is happening. And Cyril Burt found that IQ is highly heritable. These identical twins share very similar IQs, basically, is what he found. Unfortunately, the research seemed to be quite bogus. At least some of the data points seemed bogus. First of all, 53 pairs of twins raised apart is pretty hard to find, and people were suspicious of it. Then they started looking at his statistics and realized that as he added data, things like the heritability of IQ didn't change. Like, there were no changes in his heritability numbers, even with increasing data. And so the idea makes sense, the idea is good, but because when you're studying twins raised apart, they share 100% of their genetic makeup, but they have differences in environment. And so you can kind of start to tease apart how important is, one's genetic makeup and the environment. But his work was thrown away, essentially. Okay. Now there are current studies, newer studies of twins raised apart, twins raised together that are much more valid, and we buy into it. Here's an example of measuring heritability by using similarities between relatives. schizophrenia is a disorder a mental illness that you've probably heard about. If a person has schizophrenia, there are a whole suite of behavioral symptoms that the person can have, from positive symptoms like auditory hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, disorganized thinking, and negative symptoms like neglecting one's personal hygiene or a loss of speech and language, withdrawal or social isolation. Those are some of the symptoms that people with schizophrenia experience. And it turns out schizophrenia is fairly common. 1 to 2% of the population is diagnosed with schizophrenia. And prior to the advent of antipsychotic drugs in the 1950s or so, most people with schizophrenia ended up living with schizophrenia for their lives and ended up in mental institutions. There also seems to be kind of a rule of thirds with schizophrenia. About a third of people with schizophrenia have their symptoms disappear over time. About a third of people can effectively use antipsychotics and live rather normal lives. And about a third of people, antipsychotic drugs don't seem to work. They're not as effective, and they tend to be in and out of hospitals, in and out of being on the street, etc. Now, if you have schizophrenia, there are actually significant changes going on in the brain, and I have a slide about that, and you don't have to worry about these changes, but it's just kind of interesting to look at. Across the brain, there are multiple effects. It's not something that's just affecting one tiny area of the brain, but it does seem to be kind of a signaling problem with neurotransmitters. Okay, so trying to sort out the question of, this is a complex mental illness. Where does it come from? Is it heritable? Is it environmentally triggered? Is there a combination of a heritability component, a component that's genetic, and a component that's environmental? Well, how do you study this? The best way to kind of get a handle on this is to, in fact, look at families, okay? To do some family studies and ask the question, what is the heritability of schizophrenia? And so researchers have done that. They found that that schizophrenia runs in families. The general population rate for schizophrenia is about 1%. But if a parent has schizophrenia, there's about a 13% chance a child will inherit it or will have it. If a sibling has it, about 9% chance that another sibling will have it. If a monozygotic, a single zygote, an identical twin, has schizophrenia, there's about a 50% chance that their identical twin will also have it. The risk is higher with closer biological relatedness. Researchers have shown with adoption studies, too, that adopted children they've looked at adopted children with schizophrenia and then looked back at their biological families versus their adoptive families. Their biological parents, there's about a 12% chance that one of them has schizophrenia. And their adoptive parents, there's essentially a 0% chance that their adoptive parents have schizophrenia. And again, the twin studies, there are a variety of twin studies that have been done in which you're essentially examining the concordance in twin. When one member of the pair has schizophrenia, what is the likelihood that the other member has schizophrenia? And with identical twins who share 100% of their genes, this concordance rate is about 50%. In dizygotic twins, two zygotes, those are fraternal twins, they share about 50% of their genes. There's a 17% concordance. So when one member of the pair has schizophrenia, about 17% of the time the other member does as well. Taken together, all of this research has suggested that schizophrenia is in fact highly heritable. In other words, the differences we see with respect to this trait, respect to schizophrenia, are in large part attributed to differences in genetics. The measures of heritability really vary because, in fact, context affects heritability. But the measure that I have written down here is a 83% heritability. That's very, very high. In other words, genetics has variation in genetics can be attributed or influences the likelihood of schizophrenia, right? There's an important component. And what this particular example does is it shows you that twin studies can be very effective in kind of trying to tease apart this relationship between genetic components and environmental components. It doesn't do it perfectly because, frankly, twins, like identical twins, share 100% of their genome, but they also share a big, huge chunk of their environment. And that's an important criticism or critique of using twin studies in this case. We'll look at another example in the next video. Thanks. We'll escape out of here if I can. There we go.